George Whitefield was an Anglican priest and one of the founders of the Methodist movement from all the way back to the early days at Oxford, where he was an original member of the Holy Club. Whitefield was a leader in the Great Awakening, and he preached a series of revivals throughout England and in the American colonies as well. He is credited with bringing thousands of people into the Christian faith. Although he was considered to be a Methodist, George Whitefield did break away from John and Charles Wesley over issues like Calvinism, where the Wesleys subscribed to Arminianism instead. Also, George Whitefield was a proponent of slavery, unlike the Wesley brothers. Overall, we will see that Whitefield was a fairly unconventional, controversial, but also a very popular figure in early Methodism. So join me on this historical episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast as we explore the life and ministry of George Whitefield. Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist Podcast. I'm your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and I hope that you can take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can also find me on Instagram as well. My handle is @methodicalpod, so be sure to check me out. George Whitefield was born on December 27th, 1714, at the Bell Inn in Gloucestershire, England. He was the seventh child and fifth son of Thomas and Elizabeth Edwards Whitefield. He was the youngest child in the family. George's father, Thomas, managed the Bell Inn, which was a three-story structure that included a dining room, tavern, and a great room. The Whitefield family were upper middle class, and they were among the more prominent citizens in Gloucestershire. Unfortunately, when George was only 2 years old, his father passed away, very young age, and his mother Elizabeth then took over the family business and managed the inn. It's been noted that as a boy, George was regarded by his mother with a peculiar tenderness and educated with more than ordinary care. He attended a school known as the College at Gloucestershire Cathedral, and at 12 years old, he enrolled at a school attached to his local church, St. Mary de Crypt. George Whitefield describes his own childhood years, perhaps with some exaggerations of his sinfulness. This is kind of common with most theologians at this time to kind of talk up how sinful they were as kids, but he writes this: "I can truly say I was brutish from my mother's womb. Lying, filthy talking, and foolish jesting I was much addicted to. Sometimes I used to curse, if not swear. Stealing from my mother I thought no theft at all. Numbers of Sabbaths have I broken, and generally used to behave myself very irreverently in God's sanctuary. Much money have I spent in plays, cards, and reading romances were my heart's delight. Often have I joined with others in playing roguish tricks." So you can see how he describes himself as a child. I think some of us may be guilty of those same things. But, at the same time, he also acknowledges the role that God's grace played in his life at a young age as well. He talks about times when he felt God's Spirit on his heart, when he felt convictions of his sins, times when he knelt down, cried, prayed. He even admits that some of the money he stole from his parents, he would take that money and give to the poor. And he says that some of the books he stole were actually books of devotion. So it seems like not everything he did had the worst intentions there. But overall, I think Whitefield was just a normal kid. One of the more mischievous things he did, however, was that he would run into the independent meeting house during church services, and he would shout out the name of the pastor, Old Cole, Old Cole, And interestingly enough, when he was asked by one of the members in the congregation what he wanted to do with his life, he actually said that he wanted to be a minister, but then he added, "I'll take care not to tell stories in the pulpit like old Cole." So I don't know, for some reason he was picking on this local pastor. But even at a young age, Whitefield felt a call to ministry. In fact, he once said, "I was always very fond of being a clergyman and used to imitate the ministers reading prayers." His mother, Elizabeth, also believed that George was being called to the vocation of a minister. She had groomed most of her children to continue working at the inn, but she had different plans for George. She encouraged him to attend university, and it was her hope that he would indeed enter into the ministry. At an early age, Whitefield found that he had a passion and a talent for acting in the theater. He really enjoyed reading plays and performing in plays, and later on, we see how that passion of theater and speaking would carry on in his preaching through theatrical reenactments of Bible stories, which he told during his sermons, through the way that he spoke. And after George's father had been gone for about 8 years, his mother remarried a man named Capel Longden. And that's when things started to go downhill a little bit. Capel started pushing his way into some of the management of the inn. And because of his kind of bad business strategy, the inn started to suffer financially. And so by the time that Whitefield was 15 years old, his mother no longer had the funds available to be able to send him to Oxford like she had hoped. So at first, George started helping out his mother at the inn, and that was kind of challenging for him. He had a hard time watching all of his friends go off to school, and each morning he'd watch them kind of walk by the window, and he longed to do that himself. He wanted to return to school. He had these visions of grandeur. And he soon heard about this opportunity to go to Oxford University as a servitor. And in the fall of 1732, Whitefield actually entered Pembroke College in Oxford, and he kind of worked in exchange for his tuition and board. He did these menial tasks for sons of well-to-do gentlemen. So he would teach them and tutor them in the morning. He'd help them bathe. He'd clean their rooms. He'd carry their books, assist them with their work. He did all these little menial tasks for them. But after about a year at Oxford, Charles Wesley had heard that George Whitefield was this really religiously earnest individual. And so Charles went and invited George to breakfast. And it didn't take long before Whitefield joined the Holy Club, which was this group of students that were also nicknamed Bible moths, Bible bigots, and sacramentarians. And yes, even the word Methodist was thrown around a few times. But this group included about 9 people who met together and adhered a very strict monk-like lifestyle regimen. And John Wesley came and became the moderator and organizer of this group. Life in the Holy Club had a tremendous impact on Whitefield's spiritual development. And he also read a book by Henry Scougal called The God in the Soul of Man, which also had a really big impact on his life. And this eventually led to the moment that Whitefield called his conversion. It occurred a few weeks after Easter in 1735 when he was about 20 years old, and he experienced what he called spiritual awakening. But he was in such poor health, he actually became very ill because of some of the regimen of the Holy Club. But he became so ill and in such poor health that he had to return home for about 9 months to recuperate before going back to Oxford. And he describes how his life had changed during this time after his conversion when it came to reading the scriptures. He had this kind of awakening moment as he was sick, but then his mind was opened and enlarged, and he says that I began to read the Holy Scriptures upon my knees. This proved meat indeed and drink indeed to my soul. I daily received fresh life, light, and power from above. Charles Wesley actually wrote about Whitefield's zeal and dedication and this conversion experience. He writes this: "He now begins from every weight set free to make full trial of his ministry, breaks forth on every side and runs and flies like kindling flames that from the stubble rise. Wherever the ministerial spirit leads, from house to house, the heavenly fire he spreads, ranges through all the city lanes and streets, and seizes every prodigal he meets." George finished up his education and graduated with a bachelor's degree, and he then sought out ordination. He returned to Gloucestershire and applied to the Bishop Dr. Benson, and Bishop Dr. Benson agreed and ordained the 21-year-old George Whitefield on June 20th, 1736, in the Gloucestershire Cathedral. Whitefield then preached his first sermon in his hometown in the Church of St. Mary de Crypt, where he was baptized and where he went to school. And it didn't take long before people started growing very fond of Whitefield and his preaching. He was a very good speaker, even that early on. But Whitefield decided to return to Oxford, where he then became the leader of the Holy Club, because the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, had gone over to America, the New World, as missionaries in the colony of Georgia in 1735. And you can learn more about the Wesley's trip to Georgia in episode 1 about John Wesley and episode 9 about Charles Wesley. So be sure to go back and listen to those if you haven't already. But during this time, Whitefield continued his studies at Oxford and filled in at a few churches in London as a supply pastor. He filled in at Chapel of the Tower of London, as well as the supply pastor at the village of Dummer. And while he was in the village of Dummer, George Whitefield decided that he too wanted to become a missionary over in Georgia. John had actually written to Whitefield urging him to come and help him. Charles had become very sick and was unable to go on with his pastoral role in Georgia, and John needed his assistance. At this point, Whitefield had taken the first ordination vow as a deacon, and he knew he would have to come back and return to England to be ordained a second time as a priest. But he just felt like this ministry, this missionary trip to Georgia, was an opportunity that he just couldn't pass up. He wanted to leave right away, but he ended up waiting for about a year because he could not leave until Colonel Oglethorpe himself was ready to depart. And so while he was waiting, Whitefield made good use of his time. He preached in Bristol, England, where people loved him so much that they asked him to preach every week. And people were actually turned away there in Bristol because there wasn't enough room. People were constantly seeking spiritual advice from him and trying to hear him preach. Whitefield also accepted an invitation to preach at Stonehouse in Gloucestershire. Then he returned to Bristol and finally London, preaching all along the way. One person wrote of Whitefield during this time saying this: "The preaching of Mr. Whitefield excited an unusual degree of attention among persons of all ranks. In many of the city churches he proclaimed the tidings of great joy to listening multitudes, who were powerfully affected by the fire which was displayed in the animated addresses of this man of God. Lord and Lady Huntington constantly attended wherever he preached, and Lady Anne Franklin became one of the first fruits of his ministry among the nobility." Whitefield was an extraordinary and very popular preacher among all sorts of people, rich and poor alike. He referred to himself as a Methodist, and he advocated a Methodism of joy and assurance. He preached in London for nearly 4 months as he gained more and more recognition and notoriety, but finally he decided that he couldn't wait for Oglethorpe any longer. He couldn't wait to go to Georgia. He wanted to go ahead and go on his own. So then on December 30th, 1737, he climbed aboard the ship the Whitaker, and he headed to Georgia saying this: "God, give me a deep humility, a well-guided zeal, a burning love, and a single eye, and then let men or devils do their worst. Meanwhile, John Wesley was aboard the Samuel, and he was sailing back to England from America after a completely failed missionary trip. He had been caught in a messy love triangle and had been sued for over 1,000 pounds. And so Wesley really had no choice but to return home. And so as Wesley was wrapping up his trip with his tail tucked between his legs, Whitefield was just beginning his. While aboard the ship, Whitefield actually served as a chaplain to all of the folks that were sailing along with him, including the crew, about 20 women and children, and around 100 British soldiers. He taught catechism classes, he preached daily, and he slowly kind of won over the folks on board despite suffering a fever himself for a period of time. And Whitefield actually really appreciated his very short time in Georgia. It only lasted about 5 months, but after seeing several settlers die and leave behind numerous orphans, which is really sad, he actually decided he had to do something about that. He returned to England to establish an orphan house for the folks, these orphans in Georgia. And at his final worship service, Colonel Stevens said this: "The congregation was so crowded that a great many stood without the doors and under the windows, pleased with nothing more than the assurance he gave of his intention to return as soon as possible." So Whitefield went back home to England, and on the way he faced this horrible storm that actually forced them to land in Ireland. And he preached his way across the country, dining with mayors and bishops and archbishops along the way until he finally reached the port of Parkgate in England on November 30th, 1738. Whitefield went in early January to Oxford to enter the second stage of his ordination as a priest in the Church of England, and Bishop Benson had ordained him as a deacon and was now ordaining him the second time as a priest. And while Whitefield had been in Georgia, his notoriety had actually continued to grow, and some of his sermons and writings had been published without him knowing and had circulated throughout the country. But by the same token, many of the clergymen had only kind of tolerated him before and had now grown intolerable of him. So Whitefield, like the Wesley brothers, was barred from some of the churches. He was permitted to speak in other churches, but either way, he preached any chance he could get. Whitefield saw that this kind of thing was on the horizon for him and the Wesley brothers. He knew that here pretty soon they would not be permitted to speak in most, if not any, of the churches there in England. So he made the decision to follow in the footsteps of a Welsh school teacher, Howell Harris, and to take advantage of the great outdoors. So this is what Whitefield did. He began his open-air ministry. He began preaching outside. And he went to Kingswood in Bristol, and he started preaching to the coal mining district. And he wrote about his experience preaching outdoors, saying, "Blessed be God, I have broken the ice. I believe I was never more acceptable to my master than when I was standing to teach those hearers in the open fields. Some may censure me, but if I thus pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ." Whitefield was preaching to thousands of people, and he was holding around 30 meetings a week in and around Bristol. And after a while, Whitefield wrote to John Wesley and urged him to adopt this same practice of open-air preaching in Bristol. And he also recruited Charles Wesley to practice open-air preaching as well. And it didn't take long before John Wesley came to Bristol and kind of reluctantly took over the open-air preaching duties. Over time, Wesley began to really embrace this practice, partly because he was barred from most of the churches, and so he really didn't have any other choice. But while Wesley is doing this, Whitefield, meanwhile, returns to London and is preaching in a place called Mooresfield, as well as Kennington Common. And he kept up this very rigorous preaching schedule. He claimed to preach to over 30,000, 50,000, and even 80,000 people at a time. Apparently, when Whitefield returned to America later on, Benjamin Franklin actually heard him preach and did an experiment saying that he had computed he might well be heard by more than 30,000. And so, I will say there's some debate on whether or not these numbers are accurate, but nevertheless, that's what Franklin and Whitefield reported. But about this time, we begin to see some doctrinal differences and divisions take place between George Whitefield and the Wesley brothers. I talked some about this with a colleague of mine, Logan Murphy, in episode 36. George Whitefield had started adopting a more Calvinist theology. He believed in predestination, which basically states that only those elected by God receive salvation. The Wesley brothers were strict Arminians, and so they believed in free will, that we all have free will to choose whether or not we want to accept God's grace. And so John Wesley preached a sermon entitled Free Grace, where he speaks specifically against the doctrine of predestination. And by doing that, it really upset George Whitefield, who had asked Wesley if they could just both simply be silent on this matter because he didn't want to cause any unnecessary division between them. But in retaliation of Wesley preaching this sermon on free grace, Whitefield then preached at a Methodist gathering in favor of predestination, while Charles Wesley sat in the background just fuming. And while these divisions were nearing a boiling point, Whitefield took off for a second trip to America. Kind of as this all is happening, he skedaddles, goes to America, and after 11 weeks of sailing, he finally reaches Lewistown in America on October 30th, 1739. He was only 24 years old. And Whitefield returned to America a second time with two goals in mind. Number one, he wanted to establish an orphan house in Georgia. That was what he had set out to do from the beginning after leaving America the first time. But the second thing he wanted to do was to obtain knowledge of America. And so he first went to Philadelphia, and he met the Presbyterian and Baptist ministers there in the area. He began preaching there, and he quickly gained a great deal of popularity. He then traveled down to Savannah, Georgia, preaching all along the way, and the trustees of Georgia had gifted him 500 acres of land for the orphan house, which he called Bethsaida, which means a house of mercy. And while construction was going on, he rented the largest house in Savannah and filled it with orphan children. He didn't want to wait for the building to be built. He wanted to offer something for the kids right then, right there. And so he brought all these kids into this house in Savannah, and he offered them schooling, training, and Christian education. And meanwhile, while that was going on, he also continued to preach. And he then traveled back to Philadelphia, and while on the way, he wrote to Elizabeth Delamotte, a woman whom he had grown very fond of in England, and he proposed marriage to her, which I guess back then would have been okay, but I don't really see a lot of women being very happy about being proposed to in a letter. But he wrote this letter to her, but actually what he did before that was he wrote one letter to her parents asking their permission, and he attached a second letter for them to give to Elizabeth if they approved. So yeah, that's super weird. But ultimately, Elizabeth ended up marrying somebody else. She married a man named William Holland instead. And this left George Whitefield completely heartbroken. And while he was in Philadelphia, Whitefield was kind of dealing with the emotional pain of this. But then he became very good friends with Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin really supported Whitefield's efforts in his orphanage. And he actually became his chief American publisher. So, while in America, George Whitefield begins writing. He's published by Benjamin Franklin, and he writes about the cruel practice of slavery. So we see him initially speaking out against the evils of slavery, but we come to see that he reverses his opinion. I found an article from the Christian Century that was really interesting. It was entitled George Whitefield's Troubled Relationship to Race and Slavery. Thomas Kidd, the author of this article, writes that George Whitefield at first spoke out against, quote, Southern slave masters for their abuses of slaves in his published Letter to the Inhabitants of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina. Whitefield also demonstrated personal interest in African Americans who responded to his preaching, believing that they not only had an eternal fate, but they could become serious and educated Christians. Thomas Kidd goes on to write, by the mid-1740s, however, Whitefield became connected with slave masters who had converted under his ministry, and though he never publicly retracted his criticisms of the institution, he complied with his wealthy friends' offers to give him slaves and a South Carolina plantation. More importantly, Whitefield became convinced that he needed slaves to work at a Georgia plantation to fund the operations of his Bethsaida orphanage outside of Savannah, which was the great charitable project of his career. The problem was that Georgia trustees had banned slavery from the colony. Whitefield thought the ban was silly and destined to be overturned, and thus he became arguably the colony's leading proponent of slavery's legislation. Georgia did eventually permit slavery, but evidence suggests that Whitefield had already allowed slaves to work on his Georgia property before the ban was lifted. So that's a really troubling, very big black spot on George Whitefield and his ministry. We see that Whitefield and Wesley also continued to feud and fight themselves, not over the issue of slavery, but over the issue of theology, over Calvinism and predestination. And they would send letters back and forth to one another. And all the while, Whitefield was preaching in New England and down in Georgia. And then on January 16th, 1741, Whitefield set sail for England after having been in America for 14 and a half months. The division between Whitefield and the Wesleys deepened, and Whitefield constructed a meeting place called the Tabernacle for his followers, the Calvinist Methodists, and that's where they would meet together. Meanwhile, Wesley had constructed the New Room at Bristol as a meeting place for the traditional Wesleyan Methodists. So we see this division continue to get deeper, more divisive. And meanwhile, Howell Harris, who was a Welsh Calvinist Methodist, mentioned him earlier, the one who initially invited and encouraged George Whitefield to open-air preach, he had made this covenant with God to never marry, but he had fallen in love with a Welsh widow named Elizabeth James. But Harris saw that George Whitefield was longing for a marriage. He, had proposed and got denied. And so Howell Harris thought that Elizabeth James and George Whitefield might actually make a really great pair. And so he stepped aside. And Whitefield was ready to marry her on the spot. But Elizabeth James was not so sure. But she eventually did agree. And they had to kind of search around for a minister who was willing to perform the ceremony, because at the time, George Whitefield was a clerical outcast. Most Methodists were at this time. But on November 14th, 1741, the Reverend John Smith agreed to marry the couple. And so they got married. There was no honeymoon. He stayed with her for a week. And during that time, he preached twice a day and then traveled on to Bristol, Gloucester, and England. He came home on Christmas Day, but then he went right back out. And after 3 months, his wife finally joined him in London and became fairly active and involved in the Tabernacle, Whitefield's meeting house. And only 3 years in their marriage, Elizabeth gave birth to their son, John. But while they were staying at the Bell Inn, which was operated by George's brother, the baby became very sick and actually died. And it was very devastating news, and Elizabeth was left really to deal with a lot of this grief herself because George continued to travel around and preach. Whitefield also busied himself with the organizing of the Calvinist Methodists, and he began forming societies and building buildings. And so in addition to the tabernacle, he also built the society room, where people met as bands and societies exactly like John Wesley's organization of Methodism. Whitefield also formed the Calvinist Methodist Association, which actually met 18 months before Wesley held his first Methodist conference. Kind of interesting. But by 1750, Whitefield pretty much gave up his leadership in organizing Calvinist Methodism. And really that's mainly because he wanted to spend more time preaching. So he continued to kind of focus on preaching, and he did a little bit of organizing, and most people really considered Whitefield to still be their leader. But, not everybody was a fan of the Methodists. John and Charles faced their fair share of criticism and mob violence, and so too George faced the same thing. In fact, he was almost murdered by an officer that was lodging in the same place as him one time. Whitefield writes about this encounter, saying this: "The man suddenly rose up, uttering the most abusive language, calling me dog, vogue, villain, and beat me most unmercifully with his gold-headed cane. But my hostess and her daughter, hearing me cry murderer, rushed into the room and seized him by the collar. However, he disengaged himself from them and repeated his blows upon me. A second attacker then appeared, but before they could manage to kill Whitefield, the noise of the assault awoken the townspeople, who ran in and ran the attackers away, chased them away. This attack did not keep him down for long, even though he was in pretty bad shape. But on August 7th, Whitefield and his wife Elizabeth went and embarked once again to America. On October 26, 1744, at the age of 29, Whitefield arrived in York, New Hampshire. In America, he was met with a lot of criticism and blame for fanaticism that had risen up from some of the preachers while he was gone. But despite all of this, people still showed up to hear him preach, and he was happy to see that a great deal of progress had actually been made to the orphan house in Georgia. Unfortunately, again, this is where we see George Whitefield actually become an owner of slaves himself. He did not oppose slavery and actually spoke out against Georgia's banning of slavery at the time. He thought it was necessary for manual labor. Again, this is definitely a big dark spot on his ministry. And it is surprising considering Wesley was adamantly against slavery and spoke out against slavery throughout his life, especially in his older age. Whitefield, not so much. But in March 1748, Whitefield decided to travel to Bermuda after a doctor ordered him to try out this new climate because of his poor health. But of course, this did not slow Whitefield down. He began preaching 2 or 3 times a day in churches, meeting houses, homes, and in the open air. But then Whitefield was called back to England due to a lack of leadership in Calvinist Methodism. He left his wife behind in America and returned home alone. He had been out of England for 4 years, and the people were actually yearning for him to return. And it was around this time that he met with Charles Wesley and was able to bring about some sort of reconciliation. He wrote to John in an attempt to mend some fences. And so together, the Wesley brothers, George Whitefield, and Howell Harris met in a conference to consider reconciliation. In the end, Whitefield decided to give over his position of Calvinist Methodists in order to retain a warmer fellowship with the Wesleys. And so this allowed George to be free to preach and John Wesley to move forward as really the true head of Methodism. Whitefield went on to oversee the building of a second tabernacle in London, which increased his ministry. But by 1748, his health really began to deteriorate. However, he continued to preach every chance he got. He preached in Holland. He traveled again to America. In fact, he went to America for the seventh and final time in 1769, and he even traveled up to Canada and preached. In 1770, Whitefield continued preaching in spite of his poor health, and at the age of 55, he said, "I would rather wear out than rust out." His last sermon was preached in a field atop a large barrel. The next morning, Whitefield died in the parsonage of Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts, in America, on September 30th, 1770. He was buried in a crypt under the pulpit of this church. Benjamin Franklin said of Whitefield after his death, "I knew him intimately upwards of 30 years. His integrity, disinterestedness, and indefatigable zeal in prosecuting every good work I never seen equaled and shall never see excelled." Believe it or not, it was actually John Wesley who preached his official sermon in London at Whitefield's request. In his concluding statement, Wesley said, "Have we read or heard of any person who called so many thousand, so many myriad of sinners to repentance?" George Whitefield is credited with preaching at least 18,000 times to approximately 10 million listeners in Great Britain and America.